This giant helipad of a camera represents the future of phone photography. It belongs to the Oppo Find X6 Pro, a phone that's currently exclusive to China, but don't click off just yet because even though you probably won't be buying the Find X6 anytime soon, the tech behind its cameras is pretty mind-blowing. And given how expensive it is, there's only one thing really to compare it to: Samsung's $1,200 4-camera beast, the S23 Ultra. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV. Let's compare these two and take a look at the camera that might already have Samsung beaten. As much as these two phones are excellent across the board, the really big attractions here are the cameras. So let's start with that and then get to the rest in a little bit. With Samsung, you've got a new 200 megapixel 1/1.31 inch sensor backed up by the same ultra-wide and dual telephoto cameras from the S22 Ultra last year, at 3x and 10x. Oppo has fewer main cameras, but all three are larger than Samsung's. The Find X6 Pro has a trio of gargantuan 50 megapixel sensors. The main shooter is a huge 1-inch sensor, Sony's IMX989, while the ultra-wide and 3x periscope telephoto use the IMX890, a 1/1.56 inch sensor. For context, those are the same size as the main sensor from the OnePlus 11, so pretty huge. And now you can kind of understand why this camera bulge here needs to be so enormous. All of that's backed up by Oppo's Marisilicon X processing chip, which acts as a sort of go-between in the middle between the sensor and the Snapdragon chip, doing some initial processing before the image even reaches the ISP. Oppo has a clear optical advantage in most places, outside of its lack of dedicated 10x telephoto, so that being the case, let's dig into how these two compare first in photography. Starting off in regular daylight photography, the biggest difference you notice between these two is the color balance. Oppo's photos are slightly warmer, and in certain conditions definitely tend towards overcooking the colors just a little bit. For example, here in the stones in this building, they definitely aren't as vibrant or as warm as they appear in the Oppo shot. This doesn't affect every image, but it's definitely something I've noticed in one or two shots in particular situations. It can sometimes seem like Oppo is juicing up the saturation and vibrance just a little bit too much. Oppo's pictures generally have more pop to them and are less noisy in indoor conditions, but sometimes that comes at the cost of fine detail. For example, the floor tiles here are smudged away through a combination of noise reduction and brightening. So once again, we're seeing more heavy-handed processing from Oppo. That's not always a bad thing. In some situations, I actually preferred the extra punch that Oppo gives to its shots and felt like Samsung's shots were a bit flat by comparison. Dynamic range is pretty strong across both models, but I feel like it was a little bit easier for Oppo's processing to get tripped up by some backlit scenes. For example, tapping on this darkish sign against an overcast sky, Samsung was able to correctly expose, whereas on the Oppo side, it wasn't really possible to retain the cloud detail and the design of this sign here. Those are fringe cases though, and generally I was perfectly happy with the way both phones exposed their shots. The other thing you get from a large 1-inch sensor like this is a lot of natural bokeh. To be fair, Samsung's main sensor is pretty huge too, and can also give you a nice natural depth of field, but the Find X6 Pro takes things to the next level, shooting things like still life and even portraits outside of the dedicated portrait mode. The bigger sensor means you've got more wiggle room too for moving subjects in daylight, because the shutter doesn't need to stay open for quite as long. In low light, the Find X6 Pro can take great looking night shots from that main sensor without even needing to use its dedicated night mode. While shooting these, I also found its shots were more true to life and less prone to overexposure in night scenes compared to Samsung. If you've used a lot of smartphone night modes, you might notice how some like to overexpose the sky, making it look grey and unnatural, and there's none of that from the Oppo camera. And in extreme low light, the Find edges ahead slightly too, taking less time to use its night mode, while also pulling out more fine detail. This is a really fun camera to use in darker conditions, and the biggest low-key win for the Find X6 might be that you can take these kind of shots, and generally don't need to worry about holding still for night mode to engage. Both are competent performers in portrait mode, but I find myself preferring the output of the Find X6 Pro. These images do look slightly more processed than Samsung's, but it held up much better in challenging lighting conditions, and that's especially true when using a 3x lens indoors or in poorly lit areas. Take this shot for instance, and notice how there's just way less grain and noise in the Oppo version. In daylight portraits, things are much closer, and obviously both are prone to fumble edge detection just a little bit around hair and glasses if there's a lot of movement or wind. The ultra-wide on the Oppo side also really benefits from that larger sensor, and that's a difference you can see even in daytime shots if you go pixel peeping. In this shot, the edges of the frame, things like the hull of the boat, are noticeably less noisy. That's not just because Oppo has more aggressive noise reduction. In the Oppo shot, you can see the text in the badge here more clearly. Otherwise, with the ultra-wide, it's a similar story as before. Oppo tends to over-process its colors just a little bit, which can be bothersome in certain situations. The telephoto cameras are where the two really diverge though. Oppo has a single 3x telephoto behind a periscope lens because it's a much bigger sensor than Samsung's in terms of both size and resolution. That means you've got plenty of room to drill down to 6x and still retain a decent amount of detail. On the Samsung side, there are dual 3x and 10x telephotos, though with a smaller 10 megapixel resolution. These telephotos have been really interesting to compare over the past week or so, because their strengths and weaknesses are very situational. In ideal lighting for faraway subjects, Samsung wins because it just has a longer 10x zoom level. Although Oppo's photos at 10x don't look bad, if there's enough light, Samsung will take the better looking shot. At 3x in daylight, it's incredibly close once again, with the major difference being how Oppo slightly over-processes its colors. If you zoom in at a 1:1 ratio, you will see how Oppo does a slightly better job preserving some fine details, likely thanks to its higher res sensor, but there's really not a whole lot in it. 3x or above though, in low light, is a very different story. Oppo's lead in fine detail only increases in darker situations. As you'll see here, the pillars in this area of the shot retain much more fine detail in the Oppo image, whereas Samsung's is darker and grainier. Oppo does over-brighten the shadows just a little bit, but I still think the Find X6 takes the far better looking shot in this instance. At around the 10x level, it's much more situational and much more of a mixed bag for both cameras. Even in daylight, the Oppo camera is prone to producing weird artifacts when zooming in at this level, for example around the brickwork in this photo. And you can see it again in the text in this fully zoomed image here. And in this photo of a radio tower, you can see the balance here between more noise but more detail in the Samsung shot versus slightly less fine detail but a cleaner image from the Oppo camera. In other areas, you can see a slight watercolor effect when you zoom all the way in at 6x or 10x in shots from the Find. Despite the higher resolution sensor, I'd say 10x is about the useful limit of this camera right now, whereas on the Samsung side, you really can go all the way up to about 30x in decent lighting and still have a perfectly usable image. In darker conditions at 10x, both cameras face their own unique challenges. Samsung's sensor is smaller and has a narrower aperture, so it means it gathers less light and shots look darker and grainier. Meanwhile, Oppo gathers more light, but it's working with digital crop, so it tends to over-sharpen the resulting image. This shot here is a really great example of both, a dark indoor image at 10x. Neither looks great, but for very different reasons. On the video side, I feel like these two are much more evenly matched. Whether using the wide or ultra-wide camera, both offer excellent stabilization, and like I said before, the biggest difference you'll notice is in the way these two process their colors. In very dark conditions, Oppo pulls slightly ahead thanks to its larger main sensor, but otherwise there's not a whole lot in it between footage in these two main cameras. In telephoto footage though, it's a very different story. The larger sensor of the Find X6 means at 3x it's able to capture a better looking image with less grain and more fine detail. YouTube compression might make this harder to see, but there's very clearly more detail to be had in the Oppo version of this shot. At 10x though, the tables are turned. Oppo's relying on a digital crop from the 3x camera, so in most situations Samsung is able to pull ahead with its smaller sensor thanks to the fact that it's using a true 10x telephoto camera. You can clearly see the difference that makes here. As far as selfies go, it's mostly a wash in terms of regular photo quality, but one area where Oppo falls behind is its lack of 4K video support from that front-facing camera. That's something we've seen from Oppo and OnePlus flagships for years, and it's slightly baffling to still be seeing this in 2023. Let's take a quick tangent to run through the rest of the Find X6 Pro though, because there's more going on here than just photography, as important as that is. So the way I see this phone is kind of like a OnePlus 11 Ultra. Look at the hand feel and the design and of course the software, and there's an awful lot of similarity. The matte black texture with this shimmering sandstone finish is even lifted in its entirety from the past few generations of OnePlus flagships. At least that's the case with the all-black version that I've been using. The better looking variant is definitely the two-tone vegan leather model that my colleague Ben Sin has been using. The split here really helps to frame the entire design around this humongous camera module, which itself is split between the ultra-wide up top and the telephoto down below. The matte finish here is a little slippery on both phones, but I think the slightly more rounded shape of the Find X6 Pro makes it easier to one-hand even with its narrower sidewalls. That said, the large and actually quite thick camera protrusion can cause some issues, for example with some older wireless chargers. Although the S23 Ultra's cameras are large, they protrude less through the back panel. On the inside, both phones offer beastly top-tier hardware, with the major difference being Samsung has its own Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy, which runs slightly faster. Meanwhile, Oppo offers more RAM as standard. Its base model has 12 gigs plus 256 gigs. I've been using the middle spec model with a whopping 16 gigs of RAM and a still ample 256 gigs of storage. And that's all powered by a very much standard 5000 mAh battery, and if you've seen any of our other reviews and comparisons of Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 phones with this battery size, then it should come as no surprise to learn the Find X6 Pro 2 basically matches the Galaxy S23 Ultra in terms of longevity. With my usage patterns on lighter days, I could definitely get 2 days out of this device. On a single day, if you're pushing it really hard with lots of app usage, my limit was around 7 hours of screen on time, and that's very close to what I was able to get out of the Galaxy S23 Ultra. However, Samsung does offer its unique light performance profile, which can downclock the CPU slightly for better battery life without a noticeable impact on performance. That's something that you won't find on the Oppo device. Where Oppo absolutely crushes it though is with charging speeds. These aren't the fastest speeds you'll find in any Chinese phones, where some other brands are pushing truly insane 240 or 260 watt speeds that refill you from 0 to 100 in something like 10 minutes. But the 100 watt wide and 50 watt wireless charging speeds are comfortably within the realms of stupidly fast by global standards, taking the Find X6 Pro from dead to full in just over half an hour, basically the same level of performance that I saw from the OnePlus 11. So not only do you have a phone that potentially can last 2 days, but you can get that 2-day charge in less than 30 minutes. Fast wireless charging is also a nice to have extra, especially considering OnePlus no longer offers this feature. We're comparing to Samsung though, so both wired and wireless charging speeds give you a full refill in almost half the time on the Oppo device. Oppo's display is also impressive with a higher peak brightness level on paper compared to Samsung's 2500 nits versus 1750. In reality though, I found them to be about the same in day-to-day use, even in bright daylight, so you'll likely only see those very highest brightness levels when you're viewing HDR content. So next, the elephant in the room. This is a China-specific model of the Find X6 Pro that I've been using here, and that means the software here is designed for mainland China. It's running ColorOS 13.1 based on Android 13, and besides the addition of a bunch of China-specific apps and services, looks and behaves pretty much the same as Oxygen OS on a OnePlus device. The biggest difference you'll run into is this widget panel that occupies the leftmost home screen panel instead of Google Discover. On the Samsung side, obviously you'll be getting a more localized build that's actually designed for your region and your carriers. You can enable Google services on the Find X6 Pro and everything works pretty much as expected, though as you might know if you've used a mainland Chinese phone before, these Chinese builds are often much tougher on background activities, so you'll need to monkey with certain settings to make sure chat apps and other essentials aren't getting killed off in the background. So there's a little bit of extra legwork to do to make this phone fully functional outside of its intended target market. Overall then, if I was going on a trip and I was forced to take just one of these two cameras with me, it's a tough call, but I think I'd go with Oppo. It's true that Samsung's better generally at very long range zoom, but the versatility that you get from having 3 large sensors across the wide, ultra wide and telephoto is truly game changing. This feels a little bit like I'm using a phone from the future. And know reliably that you're getting a great shot every time is hugely valuable. And for the secondary cameras, while they are smaller, their sensors are still huge by any reasonable standard. That means while the optical zoom range is shorter, shots in that crucial 3 to 6 times range look phenomenal in pretty much any lighting conditions. Of course, there's no sign that the Find X6 Pro will be launching internationally anytime soon, which is a real shame because this is one of the best phone cameras that I've ever used. Nevertheless, Oppo overall takes the win in this comparison, and as unlikely as it seems, I'm still holding out some hope that more people internationally will be able to experience this fantastic camera setup. That's it for now. Let me know what you think of the Oppo Find X6 Pro down in the comments and how it compares to the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, and be sure to subscribe for more comparisons like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.